On today's show, where does Domantas Sabonis go from here after an abysmal performance against the Dallas Mavericks in the play-in tournament? And what do the Sacramento Kings need most out of the big man this summer? Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee joins me to talk about that. Plus, Chris shares with us a intriguing potential Domantas Sabonis for Zion Williamson trade. It's all right here for you on Locked On Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all off season long. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports anchor and reporter for ABC 10 News. And over the years, I have been Captain Defend Domantas Sabonis here on this podcast. I still firmly believe that the Kings can win and be successful with Domantas Sabonis on this roster. But even I, the biggest Sabonis defender out there, know that Sabonis' performance in the play-in tournament last month was pathetic, right? Like terrible. Needs to be way, way better than what it was. And I understand that a game like that, a performance like that waters the seeds of doubt that not just the national NBA audience has about whether or not you can win with Domas and if he can be a winning player when it comes to the postseason. It really waters those seeds of doubt within the hearts of the Sacramento Kings fan base. And it leaves you to think, what does Scott Perry and this new Kings front office think of Domantas Sabonis? They might be stuck with him because of the contract that he signed with the past regime. So there might be nothing that Scott Perry can do about it. But do they think Sabonis is potentially a winning player? And where does Sabonis go from here? As I think he needs to do a little bit of a damage control and repair his image as not just a winning basketball player, but a star here in Sacramento. Chris Biderman from the Sacramento Bee has, I wouldn't call him a Domantas Sabonis critic because he gives Sabonis his props when Sabonis earns it. But Biderman and I have always gone back and forth together about whether or not Sabonis was worth the contract that he signed and whether or not you can be successful and actually contend for a championship with Domantas Sabonis on your roster, especially with the amount of money that he's making. So I thought this conversation was perfect to have with Chris Biderman because we'll get both perspectives on where the Kings go from here with Domas, what Domas needs to do going from here. And then Chris brought an absolute nuke to this conversation. I urge you to stick around till the third segment, the start of the third segment, where Chris and I talk about a potential Sabonis for Zion Williamson trade. It's Chris's idea, but I'm very intrigued. I want to you listen to the conversation, you listen to Chris's proposal, his thoughts behind it, my thoughts behind it, and then share your thoughts on a potential Sabonis for Zion Williamson trade. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chris Biderman. While Chris Biderman was honeymooning with his lovely new bride, the rest of us were forced to sit inside the Golden One Center or watch on our televisions as the Kings got absolutely eviscerated in their play-in game with the Dallas Mavericks. So, Chris, congratulations. You were able to avoid that, but I'm going to force you to relive that with me as we talk specifically about Domantas Sabonis today. Sabonis' performance in that play-in game was absolutely unacceptable. I hope and believe that he would say the same thing. And what we're going to focus on this podcast, this conversation between the two of us, you and I have gone back and forth about Domantas Sabonis many times over the last couple of years, is just where Sabonis goes from here, where the Kings go from here with Domas. And the first question that I'll ask you, the first thing I think we have to talk about is whether or not Domas needs to do any kind of image damage control, because I felt after his performance in the best of 7 series with the Golden State Warriors, it wasn't good enough, but it was at least still pretty solid. And I did feel, okay, the Kings can build off this. Sabonis can build off this. It's one playoff series. Where can they go from here, right? There was at least some optimism of he will and can improve. that performance against Dallas was abysmal. Like, just completely did not show up in a game where the Kings absolutely need you to show up. Do you think there needs to be some sort of damage control for the image and reputation of Domantas Sabonis? Not that he's a bad guy, but when it comes to being a star and now a $40+ million per year player, does there need to be some damage control for Domas and his image here in Sacramento?
Yeah, I'm not really sure what that looks like aside from just being better on the court, being a more aggressive offensive player, being somebody who looks for his shot more often, maybe outside of just, so I know there was a lot of talk going into the season how he wants to shoot a bunch more 3-pointers, and he did that. But they were basically all spot up 3-pointers that other teams are willing to give him.
Wide open.
Yeah, he's not somebody who's going to get to the mid-range off the dribble. He's not anybody who's going to shoot off the dribble threes. It's like, if it's a standalone spot up 3, he'll take it and he'll shoot it at a pretty good clip, to his credit, and he rebounds really well. But I just think that, and but this is funny that we're having this conversation on this podcast, given all the conversations you and I have had on this very, very exact subject over the last couple of years. But, my critique of Domantas Sabonis has never been that he's a bad player or that you can't win with him. It's just, he can't be a $40 million a year guy who is a centerpiece of your team, in my opinion. Like, I think at best on a contending team, he's your 3rd or 4th best guy, and you have length and shot blocking around him. And, the thing moving forward, like, what does that look like? How do you build a contending team around Domantas Sabonis? Is it moving him to the 4? Do you move him to the 4? Is he sort of your playmaking 4, sort of what, Mike Brown used to talk about Draymond Green a lot, and comparing Domantas Sabonis in terms of what he does offensively as a screen setter and a roller and somebody who can play 4-on-5 in the pick and roll. I think there's an opportunity potentially, if you can find a shot blocking center and or stretch 4 who can block shots. The problem is those players are hard to come by, and they're at a premium, and the Kings are limited on assets because they don't have a ton of cap space. They don't have a lot of tradable assets that other teams would really want. And so that's why I always push back when it was announced that the Kings signed him to that contract extension, and it was viewed as this win. Like, I understand why the Kings felt like they needed to do it from an optics perspective, but the downside of signing him to that contract is where they are now. You have Domantas Sabonis on $40+ million a year, and I don't think he has a whole lot of trade value right now, given how he's played, and given what we see teams need to win in the playoffs. I think he's a good player. I think he's a very productive player. He's a very reliable player in that, he plays a ton of games. He plays a ton of minutes. He just doesn't give you much defensively, and you need a very specific type of team around him to succeed offensively. And to me, if I'm building a team, I just don't want that guy at $44 million a year. I'd rather have a more defensive-minded center, maybe making $20 million a year in the Zubats. I can never pronounce his name, but Zubats, the center for the Clippers. Like, he's making half of what Domantas Sabonis makes, and he allows them to be a great defensive team, which plays a lot better in the playoffs.
So I think it's a fair way to put, when it comes to the Domantas Sabonis contract, I think it's fair to put it this way. It's a contract that Monty McNair's regime can live with, because in many ways, what I always felt was the significance of the money was less than the significance of retaining the talent, especially when you traded Tyrese Halliburton for him. But that was also with the understanding that when the Sacramento Kings extended Domantas Sabonis, it was coming off of a playoff appearance. It was that he seemed to be a good partner with De'Aaron Fox, which you had never been able to find as a big man. So at the time, the signing is about kind of securing that future. As we know, go ahead.
The best justification for signing him is the ecosystem that you built, right? Because it was contingent on Kevin Herter being a 40% 3-point shooter on high volume, and the same with Keegan Murray, right? But when you go get DeMar DeRozan and then later move off of De'Aaron Fox to Zach LaVine, you blew up that ecosystem, and then now all of a sudden what you're paying for doesn't necessarily make sense.
And now
right?
that's where Scott Perry inherits the situation and looks at Sabonis and goes, okay, I didn't sign him to this contract. Now this is a contract that I feel I have to deal with. And that's where I feel that's the position that Perry's in. Chris, I have the belief that unfortunately next season is going to sort of be rinse and repeat. I don't think it's going to be a full-on run it back, because I would be very surprised if DeMar DeRozan's still on this roster. Maybe the team will be worse because of that, because I don't see many scenarios where the Kings trade DeMar DeRozan and get better or get a better player unless they get good depth and things start to click and figure it out a little bit. I have a feeling that this upcoming season is going to be, it's a term that people hate, but like a gap year of, or almost like an audition or tryout year in many ways for Scott Perry, and the first step towards him building his vision for the Sacramento Kings. But for lack of a better term, you're kind of locked in or stuck has a negative connotation, but Domas is part of your vision, at least in the short term, because he has to be. Like, the contract is extremely difficult to move. It probably not as difficult to move as Zach LaVine's, but the benefit of Zach LaVine's contract is in a year, it's now an expiring deal. And that's a lot easier to move regardless of the dollar value than Domas, who is just
unless do they extend Zach LaVine?
Oh, which okay. Let's just hash this out. If the Sacramento Kings extend Zach LaVine, I'm going right back to the ownership accusations, because I left Scott Perry and Doug Christie's press conference, and I was willing to I'm still skeptical about the process of the hiring of Scott Perry. I'm skeptical about how much Doug Christie was enforced upon Scott Perry. Regardless, it's done. I left that press conference in my interview with Doug, and I was like, okay, I'm ready to kind of put that to the side. Like, it's their team, it's their group. Let's see what the two of these guys can do. If an extension of Zach LaVine happens, especially if it happens this offseason or early on next season, you're not going to stop hearing the ownership over involvement accusations from me there. But when it comes to Sabonis specifically, like, what do the Kings need the most out of Domas this summer, do you think?
Confidence in his offensive game. Like, they need him to become a confident shooter and somebody who can get his shot in a big spot and not have it just be like, when he has the ball at the top of the key, like, go drive, go make a play, like, learn to go right. Like, opponents always overplay him to go left because he goes left so often. And that's not necessarily, like, he just needs to learn. He needs more of a bag. And again, that's kind of the issue. It's like, when you pay a guy that much, he either needs to be an elite defender or an elite offensive player, or ideally both. And he's an elite offensive player in terms of facilitating and screening, but teams overplay his teammates in the passing lanes, which is what the Warriors sort of created the template for in that playoff series. And they force him to take shots, and he's just hasn't proven to be comfortable, confident, and or reliable enough to take shots in big spots. And that, to me, I don't know if he's ever going to get there, but that, to me, is the only way that, if he starts becoming a go-to option outside of Zach LaVine, and if DeMar DeRozan is back, like, if he can score on his own off the dribble, that would be a huge boon for the Kings, because they need that from him, because he would create so much more space for other people if all the screening and passing was complemented with scoring. But it hasn't been. And I think that's been, kind of the biggest critique of him, particularly in these big moments. He's just not confident in his own shot. So I think it's a tall task for sure. And I don't know if he'll ever get there, but I think that's what he needs to do offensively in order to justify the money he gets and be somebody that you feel okay about sticking around for the length of the contract. Otherwise, if he's not that guy, then it's mostly an immovable contract as he gets into his 30s. Like, and for his sake, hopefully it's not too late for his game to continue to evolve, because, like, you don't see oftentimes as guys, he's 29 now. You don't see guys really evolve into like changing their game for the better at this point in their careers too often. But that's what the Kings need of him. Do they get that? That's a giant question mark, and I probably wouldn't bet on it, to be honest.
Today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is brought to you by Car Gurus. Shopping for a car should be exciting, not exhausting, but between the confusing prices and hidden fees, it can feel overwhelming. That's why I love using Car Gurus. They help you cut through the noise and show you the best deals with full confidence. With over 4 million listings, CarGurus has more new and used cars than any other major online marketplace in the United States. They verify dealers, provide real price analysis, and give you the tools and data that you need to make the right choice without second guessing yourself. If you need a deal that you can trust, CarGurus makes it easy to compare vehicles side by side with unbiased deal ratings. The best feature, price drop alerts, so you know exactly when the perfect car is available in your budget. Plus, the in-depth vehicle details give you peace of mind before stepping onto any sort of lot. It's no wonder SimilarWeb estimated traffic data shows that CarGurus is the #1 most visited car shopping site. Buy or sell your next car today with CarGurus at CarGurus.com. Go to CarGurus.com to make sure your big deal is the best deal. That's CarGurus, CarGurus.com. CarGurus.com. Yeah, Domantas Sabonis makes too much money and is too talented to just be complacent with, to just say, oh, he is what he is. Like, it's easy to say that about DeMar DeRozan when he's 35, 36 years old in the sunset of his career. Like, Domas still has more to give, and every player should strive to constantly be getting better. At least that's the cliche that they'll all talk about when you ask them. But to put it bluntly, Chris, would it be naive for not just fans, but for the front office, for Doug Christie, to attach a lot of their hope for improvement and success of this team, at least on the floor record-wise, next season? Because for all belief, the expectation is still for this team to be competitive next season. If they're putting that on Domas getting better offensively and becoming something that he's never really been, that we've been asking him to be for the last 3 years, like, is that naive?
It depends on what your expectations are. Like, if you want to be a fringe playoff team and be in the play-in, and if everything goes right, maybe you're a 6 seed, then you feel fine with where you're at with Domantas Sabonis. If you want to be a top 4 seed and actually contend year in and year out for the Western Conference Finals or moving to the second round and beyond, you need to I don't know if you can get there with Domantas Sabonis making $40 million. So it's all about expectations. And that's been one of my biggest critique of the Kings, is that, look, I get what the history is. And if all you want to do is get to the playoffs and have what you had in 2023 and just the excitement of getting to the postseason to make the fan base happy after suffering for so long, then that's fine. If that's your goal, then the Kings are probably closer to that than they are obviously to contending, because they're not being super ambitious when it comes to contending. Like, there was plenty of evidence showing what Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan would be as a pairing in Chicago. And there was evidence of what Domantas Sabonis looks like in a playoff series against a really smart and good defensive team. So it doesn't seem like they're taking these big swings. It seems like they're kind of content with, hey, let's, everything goes awesome. We have great health. Let's, we might be able to be a 6 seed and maybe we can punch above our weight and win a playoff series. And if that's the goal, then I think the Kings are sort of reasonably within that goal. Like, that's a reasonable thing for them to think they can achieve. But with Zach LaVine on his contract and Domas on his contract, and the lack of draft picks, and this being a weak free agent class, and not having a ton of super tradable, interesting assets that other teams might be coveting, I don't know if you're in a position to be ambitious enough to try to contend without tearing it all down. And so, a teardown is tough. And I understand why this fan base and why this front office wouldn't want or wouldn't have an appetite to, be bad for 2 or 3 seasons and get get a draft pick and do what the Pistons did or do what Oklahoma City's done. But would you trade 3 years of being bad for 8 years of contention? Like 8 years of being in the mix potentially for the conference finals every year? Like me personally, I would, but I don't think given the Kings history that they have an appetite for that because the playoff drought was so long. And I wonder if at a certain point ownership is just going to say like, actually, we do need to tear this down and we do need to tank for a year or two. We do need to get some good players on rookie scale contracts, which they don't really have an avenue towards right now. Like, I don't know what deal. I mean, I actually have one specific trade for Domantas Sabonis, which we can talk about. And maybe two, but I just don't, it doesn't really seem like there are feasible opportunities for the Kings as constructed to get to contention, which falls back on ownership being complacent and saying, or not complacent, but being content with saying, yeah, the 6 seed's fine for us. The best case scenario, 6 seed's fine for us.
We'll get to those two Domas trades because I'm very curious, as I'm sure the listeners are. Before we get to that, though, one last thing. Is one of the problems that I've kind of had with the Kings recently is it feels like they go against the grain or they do not like to follow the blueprint. What you said is like a tear down and a rebuild, what the Oklahoma City Thunder have done, other teams before that, the process in Philadelphia, even if that hasn't resulted in a championship, that team was a legitimate contender for a while until this disaster of a last season happened. Like that blueprint plus the blueprint of properly vetting and hiring a general manager and not hiring their competition as the assistant GM or not bringing in or forcing assistant coaches on a coaching staff like they did with Doug Christie for Mike Brown. Like the Kings just have a tendency, this ownership group has a tendency to do things their way. Like they just kind of always have. So I keep that in mind when I think of, can Sacramento do both? And what I mean by that is, can the short-term plan be go for the 6 seed like you talked about and be okay with that while we play out the year or two of at least Zach LaVine's contract and get 2 years closer to the end of Domantas Sabonis' contract? That therefore gives Perry time to, at least for next season, analyze what he has, make decisions on some of these big contract guys. He now has finally all of these draft picks freed up now that the Kevin Huerter trade is finally over and done with, as much as it sucks to not have a first round pick right now. So he can decide to trade those picks in a big swing deal if he wants, or go into next summer if the Kings have a bad season and have a player that maybe he could draft in the lottery to start to build around, and you start there. Like, can the Kings, at least for next season, once again have that goal of let's be okay and happy with just making the playoffs and hopefully winning a playoff series for now, and then start our rebuild or have a softer launch to a rebuild rather than a hard tank? That's against the blueprint. Is it possible?
Yeah, it's possible because, I mean, it's possible as long as they don't extend Zach LaVine, right? Because he's under contract next year and he has a player option for, I think, $48 million, which
it's like
yeah, 49 million, 48.9. Yeah, not to bite Ryan Russillo's bit, but I think we can report that he's probably going to pick that up.
You think so?
Yeah, I do think so. Yeah, if they maintain flexibility contractually with Zach LaVine, and when I say flexibility, just not extending him and
Yes.
having that as an expiring deal, because like Zach LaVine, his season with Chicago was great. Like it was what he was before he got to Sacramento was really, really interesting from the standpoint of he was viewed as having the worst contract in the league and viewed as an untradeable asset. And then it's like, oh, he's actually healthy and he's being hyper efficient and maybe he could really help a contending team. The fit obviously wasn't great with the Kings because they went from having too many point guards to no point guard. And you talk to, one thing I keep saying, and I've said this, and I think I've said this to you on your pod, and I've said this on radio spots. I talked to DeMar DeRozan in Boston, I think it was in January, about why things didn't work in Chicago. And he said, well, Lonzo getting hurt really screwed us because we never had a real point guard. And, you know, he was a firm believer that him and Zach could have worked with the right facilitator of the offense, a pass first sort of stereotypical point guard. Lo and behold, Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan are reunited in Sacramento, and they don't have a point guard, and it proves to not work. So, you know, like these are kind of things that you could foresee happening. But I think the Kings can, if they don't extend Zach LaVine, they can maintain flexibility, use his contract as an expiring. Maybe there's a team that needs a hired gun scorer to come in and give them a jolt. You know, I don't know if the Nuggets would do this, but I know Zach LaVine sort of seems like a fit for the Nuggets. I don't know if the Kings would want Michael Porter Jr. back. But that's kind of what it would have to look like. But I think the Kings can be sort of that competitive fringe playoff team next year with Zach LaVine in tow, if they can get a point guard and then maintain flexibility going forward and decide, all right, do we want to extend Zach LaVine, which I think is pretty clear, I think would be a mistake. But if they don't extend him, then they have that $50 million essentially coming off the books. It's a tradable asset, and then they can start rebuilding for draft picks or get a bunch of role players that make sense around Sabonis. You know, there are possibilities there to where I think extending him would take a lot of those possibilities away.
This episode of the Locked On Kings podcast is also brought to you by Skims. When I found out Skims was making underwear for men, I was intrigued. I've heard so much about their quality from friends and from family, so I had to give it a try, and let me tell you, they live up to the hype. I've always had issues with finding the right underwear, right? It always feels like you have to sacrifice something: fit, comfort, style, all of the above, right? Skims changed that. They check all the boxes. Their men's line offers something for everyone, from boxers briefs to classic briefs, all designed with the perfect balance of comfort and style. The Stretch 5 boxer briefs are the go-to for me. I'm actually wearing a pair of them right now because they fit my lifestyle actually really perfectly. If I'm spending a lot of time sitting at a desk working at the ABC 10 studios, they're comfortable for that. But I can also wear them out if I'm headed to the gym, or I'm being active, chasing my kid around, or I'm going and playing a round of golf. It can handle it all and be comfortable all day long. Shop Skims Mens at skims.com/lockedonnba and Skims stores. Let them know that we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. Skims is the official underwear partner of the NBA, WNBA, and USA Basketball. All right, fire off these 1/potentially 2 Domantas Sabonis trade ideas you've got.
So it kind of started out as a joke, and this was during the regular season, and you know, it seemed kind of like a joke. Things weren't going well in New Orleans. You probably know where I'm going with this, but you look at it right now after what we saw with the Kings in the play-in against Dallas. Zion Williamson, I think the Kings need to take a swing. I think they're like their best chance. And if they're not just going to tear it all down and rebuild, if they do want to remain competitive and at least interesting, can they buy low on Zion with a Domantas Sabonis trade? And if you're New Orleans, it actually makes sense because you do have those long, athletic, defensive-minded wings in Trey Murphy and Herb Jones that might complement what Sabonis does. And if you're New Orleans, you're looking at it and saying, we've dealt with so many injuries, so many missed games. Zion's been arguably the most unreliable star in the league. At least now we can get a super reliable player who might fit in with what we do, and the roster you have around him could complement him. So if you're the Kings and you're saying, look, we want to remain competitive, this might be our only opportunity, or our only avenue we have right now towards a top 10 type talent in the NBA. Zion Williamson might be that guy. So I think you can make a pretty compelling case that a trade involving Domantas Sabonis for Zion Williamson makes sense for both sides. Obviously, there's risk involved. Like there's health issues with Zion coming here. I do think, you know, getting out of the South getting away from the New Orleans food and, you know, maybe integrating some farm to fork Sacramento healthy vegetables, like the fresh food here in Sac could help Zion. So I do think there's a possibility of Zion actually sort of being a reclamation project in Sac. And if Zion came to Sacramento and played like he did a couple years ago and looked like an MVP candidate, like he would be a legend in Sacramento. He would be one of the most beloved players in this area's history for sure. So if I'm Scott Perry, I'm absolutely exploring that, because I think it's the Kings don't really have that many avenues towards a top 10 type player. And I would say you can make a similar case for Ja Morant. I just don't know if there's a trade that would entice the Grizzlies to move off of Morant in the same way that you might be able to entice New Orleans with Sabonis, given his reliability and given the way he could potentially fit with that roster they have with Trey Murphy and Herb Jones.
Okay. Dang it, Chris. We could do a whole freaking podcast on this, and now I'm mad at you. Zion by himself is not appealing to me because of the risk factor to it and the fact that, I mean, look, like these are the last 6 seasons, 24 games, 61 games, did not play an entire season, 29 games, 70 games, and then 30 games. Like that's like Zion's reliability is not there. Yeah. So if you're telling me you start your rebuild, start your Sacramento Kings franchise with Zion, I'm not interested in that. But that's by itself. Now you bring in the context of, well, look, Zion has 3 years left on his deal. 39.4 million, 42.1 million, 44.8 million. That contract is smaller than Domas's. So
right. And it's not guaranteed either.
Right.
So you can pivot.
When you bring in the context of swapping Domas's contract for Zion's contract, at the very, very least, it's a wash. And on top of that, we kind of know or believe we have a pretty solid idea of what the Kings are with Domas as their core, at least now that De'Aaron Fox is gone. And we have no idea what a core with Zion Williamson at the center of it or at the middle of it can do. So it's funny. I did a podcast last week where I threw caution to the wind. I said, F it, forget your brain. Let's go with heart and let's burn this city to the ground. And I talked about the idea of the Kings just going for a big swing Trae Young trade. I'd put a Zion deal like this in the same category to where if you want to do something, Chris, the one thing that I'm asking for this offseason above everything else is give me a reason to be interested again. This would do it. Right. But I also do so knowing that if the Kings get 55 games out of Zion next season, you have to count that as a victory. And in the other 30 or whatever games that he's not playing, can the Sacramento Kings be good enough with Zach LaVine and friends to carry them through that? I'm intrigued. I don't think it works, but I'm intrigued. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I'm of the belief, and I think Kings fans don't love to hear this stuff, but like, either you're contending or you're rebuilding, and if you're in the middle, that's the worst place to be. And the Kings,
it's not a belief, it's fact. It's true.
Yeah.
If you're mid, it's purgatory.
Right. To me, that's where the Kings are. And they're at least 2 seasons from getting out of that. So in terms of being interesting or lifting your ceiling, that's kind of where the Zion idea comes from, is that, well, you actually have a direction, because right now the direction is, all right, your ceiling is a 6 seed. And if you're content with that and you're Vivek and you just want to get to the playoffs and host a few playoff games, then that's fine. Then that's like I said, a reasonable goal. But if you want to lift your ceiling and actually be a contending team, then you need to potentially take a swing on star players and maybe find a distressed asset. And I think Zion is a distressed asset. I think Ja is probably a distressed asset who you might be able to buy low on. Otherwise, I don't know, otherwise you're just going to be in that purgatory. And if you're in that purgatory because Zion only plays in 55 games, then I think that's far more palatable. At least you're interesting. You'll be a much more interesting team to watch and talk about than, this version that we've seen the last 2 years.
Well, now I want to hear from the people. I want to know what people think about and how they feel about that potential Zion Williamson trade. So leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like that trade, if you do it, if you wouldn't, you can tweet me at @MattGeorgeSack. You see Chris Biderman's handle there at Chris Biderman. Let us know if you would do that trade, because I'm very curious about that. Chris, before we wrap up really quick, yesterday I did a podcast about Keegan Murray's contract situation and whether the Kings should play the short game, meaning extend him this summer, or the long game of wait till next season, potentially allow him to test free agency as a restricted free agent and let other teams test the market. And you have another year of context of who Keegan Murray can be. We don't have time to dive into what the numbers would look like or anything like that. But if you were Scott Perry taking over the situation, would you be more inclined to just try and secure Keegan to a 5-year rookie contract extension? Or would you be a little more patient and wait and see what another year of Keegan? Maybe this is the offensive leap year that you're hoping for from Keegan.
If I'm the Kings, I'm probably trying to extend Keegan now because I feel like given the season he just had, his number would probably be lower than it would be if he did have that breakout season that you're talking about, right? So if you can get Keegan on a quote unquote discount, or at least on a contract commensurate with how he played last year, then going forward, that could be a big time asset for you, whether you keep him on your team on an affordable contract. Like that would be a great development, or you add to his trade value by having a two-way wing who can shoot on an affordable contract. That could be a huge asset for them. So for me, I'm trying to lock up Keegan now because that number is probably lower this summer than it would be if he averages, say, 18 points per game next year on 40% shooting from three and shows more, offensive versatility and continues to play, capable defense and is switchable and things like that. Like Keegan wasn't as good as the Kings would have hoped he would have been, but I think there's still a lot of room for him to grow and become a really viable two-way player for them at an area of weakness on the roster because they don't have any or too many two-way wings who can shoot. So Keegan represents that. So if you can get him, say you got Keegan on $15 million a year for the next 4 or 5, that would ultimately be, I think, a good value if you did see that big leap from him. And then, he becomes a real asset for you. Would Keegan do that? And would his camp do that? That they're in a really interesting spot, because if they have a lot of belief that that Keegan will improve a lot, then Keegan's saying, I'll wait till restricted free agency where I could get a much bigger contract and then force the Kings' hand a little bit. But if I'm the Kings, I'm trying to do it now.
Well, putting my producer hat on, we might, depending upon how the audience reacts to it, might have to have Chris Biderman back to dive more into that potential Domas and Zion trade a little bit later.
Kings fans love me, especially the way I talk about Domas.
Well, we'll get through the offseason together. Chris Biderman, thanks for taking the time. My man, appreciate you always spending time here on Locked On Kings. I feel like that trade's going to be a talker and intriguing, so we might just have to talk more about that down the line. But I appreciate you, my friend. Let's get through this offseason together.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully I can see you on the golf course sometime soon.
I'm terrified to pick up a club.